There everyone, welcome to another video, and not just any video, but a video that's rather a must when your whole channel is about Roman Britain. Now when I was very small, I remember going on family holidays to Newcastle upon Tyne to visit my gran, and it was during one of these visits that I really remember my love of Romans coming alive. Now why is that, do you ask? Well, from Newcastle in the east to Carlisle in the west lies one of the most important things that the Romans ever left in Britain. I'm of course talking about Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian's Wall is quite possibly the most important legacy the Romans left in Britain, but in order to fully understand it, we really should look at the history leading up to Hadrian's great building project. So in 43 AD, Emperor Claudius ordered his invasion of Britain, and over the following decades the Romans found themselves travelling further and further north, until they seemingly reached their peak at the Battle of Mons Gravius in modern-day Scotland. But because of needs elsewhere in the empire, perhaps along the Danube frontier, Roman legionaries were pulled from Britain, so the Romans couldn't consolidate any gains they had made in Scotland. And around 100 AD, the frontier was decided to go along what was called the Stanegate Road, which ran from a fort in Carlisle to a fort in Corbridge in modern-day Northumberland. And it was just north of this road that Emperor Hadrian decided to have his wall built. And now that that's out of the way, let's begin the video proper. Hadrian's Wall marks the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. Built during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, its construction began in 122 AD. At its peak it was a huge stone wall, some 8 feet wide, some 12 feet tall, running a staggering 73 miles from coast to coast, complete with forts, mile castles and turrets. The wall itself was built by legionaries based in Britain at the time, the 2nd Legion Augusta, the 6th Legion Victrix, and the 20th Legion Valeria Victrix, although they also had help from auxiliary units and members of the British fleet. It took about 6 years to build, and modifications were still being done to it even after Hadrian died in 138 AD. In terms of who actually manned the wall, that honour fell to the auxiliary units of the Roman army. And those auxiliary units tended to come from provinces in the northwestern part of the empire. Interestingly, the wall was not entirely made of stone to begin with. In the original plans, the stone wall was meant to run some 45 Roman miles from Newcastle to the River Irving, and from that point it was meant to be a turf wall. But this turf wall was upgraded partly during Hadrian's reign and partly during the reoccupation of the wall after the abandonment of the Antonine Wall in 162 AD. And don't you worry, I'll cover the Antonine Wall in a separate video, it's fascinating in of itself. Now the reason why there was a turf wall in the west we're not entirely certain, but there are a couple of theories. The first states that the quality of stone in the west wasn't good enough, so they had to import it from elsewhere. Whilst the second theory states that the tribes in the western part were far more hostile, so in order to set up the frontier they had to put up the wall much quicker. The wall, of course, wasn't just a wall, it was also a collection of forts, mile castles and turrets, and each fort was built to house on average one auxiliary unit each, some 500 to 1,000 men, and had everything that a Roman soldier would need: barracks, granaries, toilets, hospitals, that sort of thing. Mile castles, on the other hand, only held 20 to 30 men, and they controlled the flow of goods in and out of the empire. They were located roughly every Roman mile across the entire length of the wall, and there were 80 in total. And between each mile castle there were 2 equally placed turrets that held 8 men each, and they acted as lookouts across the frontier. When Hadrian became emperor in 117 AD, he inherited an empire that had a lot of unrest in it. It was also at its greatest extent as a result of his predecessor Trajan. But rather than expanding the empire any further, he decided instead to consolidate, and started reinforcing the frontier, with things like his wall in Africa, the Limes Germanicus in Germany, and of course his wall in Britain. Now, there's no doubt that the sight of the wall in Britain will have had a deep psychological impact to those living there, but the reason why the wall was built is still hotly disputed to this day. The idea that the wall was purely built to stop an invasion from people living in the north is not widely accepted nowadays, and instead the prevailing theory is that it was used to control the flow of goods and people in and out of the empire. Due to its use of forts and mile castles, soldiers would be able to search, tax, and funnel people through specific gates before they would be allowed to continue. An example of how this frontier system worked can be seen in the 1st century AD, when members of the Ubi tribe tried to travel from Germania into the Roman provinces. But before they could cross, they had to give up their personal possessions and any weapons they had. In this respect, the frontier system worked in a similar way to borders between countries today. Evidence of how Roman soldiers lived on the wall is sparse, but due to the nature of how the Roman army operated elsewhere in the empire, we can put together a pretty decent image of how a day-to-day life of a Roman soldier will have looked. Now, part of their day will have been taken up with military training, as Roman manuals stress the importance of things like regular weapons drills, physical training, and military exercises, which included mock battles. The rest of their time will have been taken up with very tedious jobs such as guard duty or uniform cleaning, but their main responsibility will have been patrolling the wall or the lands just north of the wall. But life on the wall wasn't all work. Evidence from Hadrian's wall shows that soldiers relaxed in various different ways. The most obvious of these is of course the bathhouses that were built either in or just outside their forts, and these acted very much like a British army naffy, where they would be able to get mugs of wine or beer and sit around and play board games or dice. They would also be able to take part in blood sports such as hunting wild boar, and they also had a diet that in the 2nd century AD was not to be sniffed at. It sometimes even included oysters, which I personally don't like, but I can see how they would be a treat for a soldier on the wall. Now, if a soldier really wanted to, they could also go round to the local settlement, otherwise known as a vicus. Now, these often sprung up near forts that the Romans built, and they contained shops, inns, and gambling establishments, a great place for a soldier to spend their hard-earned cash. Now, of course, I can't talk about Hadrian's Wall without talking about its impact on the local population. Farmers, for a start, they were impacted by the wall going up. The wall went indiscriminately from coast to coast, often cutting through their territory, meaning that farmers couldn't get to some, if not more, of their own land. Another example, the Brigantes. They were cut in two as a result of the wall going up. Another change was the arrival of Roman soldiers, which put an end to local ritualised warfare, and also saw an increase in the number of civilian settlements that went up, complete with families, craftsmen, traders, all living side by side with the Romans. After Hadrian died in 138 AD, his successor Antoninus Pius abandoned the wall and moved the frontier 100 miles north to where the Antonine Wall was built. But as we've already discussed, this too was abandoned, and Hadrian's Wall was reoccupied in 162 AD. From this point onwards, it seems to have been in near constant use by the Romans until they left Britain entirely in the early 5th century. But evidence suggests that the wall was still being used, most likely by local Britons, well into the 5th century. As is normally the case with abandoned stone structures, we find that a lot of the stone from Hadrian's Wall is present in other buildings, such as at St Paul's Church in Jarrow, where the Jarrow inscription was found in 1782. Interestingly, knowledge as to who actually built the wall seems to have been lost for a very long time, as many simply labelled the wall the Picts' Wall, while others, like the Venerable Bede in the 7th century, gave credit to Septimius Severus, something that stuck for centuries, as in 1610, for example, a map by William Matthew labels it as the Severus Wall. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that credit was properly given to Hadrian for the wall's construction. Hadrian's Wall is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and sees over 100,000 visitors per year, many of whom walk the full length of the wall. It's been the inspiration for the wall in George R. R. Martin's books A Song of Ice and Fire, and it's also appeared in films such as Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. New discoveries are always being made along the wall, and if I've inspired you to go back, or if you haven't been before, I heartily recommend that you do so. There's nothing quite like seeing it in person. Now, I can't possibly cover everything about Hadrian's Wall in one video, but I hope that I've given you a brief as I can anyway, insight into its history. But thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one. Ciao for now.